Hello. Hello, ni hao, xin chào, or whatever else your greeting of choice may be from High Farm, Vietnam. Recently, well, a couple of months ago now, I finished a 5 to 10K training plan from this here book, Jack Daniel's Running Formula. It's a very popular book with some very popular training plans, and I wanted to give it a go to mix things up from my usual marathon training routine. I've got a few videos that I'll link to below covering each phase of the training plan in a little bit more detail, while this video is mainly going to include a general overview, my reflections on the training, how it went, and what I would do differently if I was going to do the training plan again. Hello! First things first, I just want to give a brief overview of the book itself. As you can probably see, my version is in Chinese. That's because I bought it while I was still living in China, where it was significantly cheaper than buying an imported English language copy. It's probably a decent gauge of how simple and straightforward the information is and how clearly it's presented, that I could read this without stopping and having to look up any terminology in the dictionary. I'm not trying to blow my own awkwardly accented trumpet here. What I'm saying is that there's not a lot of technical language or in-depth scientific concepts. This book clearly lays out a lot of the background information on the principles of training and how to go about putting them into practice. But it's all fairly basic, surface level stuff, and it's presented in easy to understand layman's terms. That's great if you're new to the theory of running and looking for a basic introduction to the key components of training. It's going to lay things out fairly concisely and give you a good overview. But if you already understand the rudiments and are looking for a deeper understanding, I don't think you're going to get too much out of this book. In terms of specific content, there are chapters in here that cover, introduce, or lay the groundwork for the principles of training, constructing a training plan, cadence, breathing, running efficiency, heart rate, VO2 max, different training types, easy, marathon tempo, lactate threshold, intervals, and repeats, treadmill running, the VDOT system, which is the pace calculator for all intents and purposes, periodization, altitude training, rest, supplemental training, so things like strength work, cross-country, and of course, training plans. This includes training plans for the 800 meters, 1500 meters to 2 mile, 5 to 10K, half marathon, and marathon. In terms of the information in the book, I found it clear, concise, informative, and practical. I would recommend it to beginner runners who want a very friendly introduction to training principles, even if you're not necessarily interested in the training plans themselves, though I should reiterate that this is a basic overview and there is not a lot of deep theory or science in here. To clarify what I said just now, the book contains a 5 to 10K training plan, which is to say that there is a single combined plan for the 5K and the 10K distances. Now my goal with this period of training was to improve my 5K time, and so obviously that is the plan that I went with. But you would be following exactly the same plan if you were targeting a 10K race or time trial. At this point, I feel it is very important for me to say that while there is no separate 5K and 10K plan, there are two separate plans based on differing amounts of total weekly mileage. This is important because while they're framed as plans for different total mileage targets, I feel as though they're better understood as plans for different levels of ability. And this is where I made a really big mistake. I picked the high mileage plan because it was far closer to the amount of mileage that I'm used to running in training. However, in hindsight, I should have gone for the low mileage plan because, again, in hindsight, I think it better represents the amount of training load that I can handle as an amateur runner. Even someone who runs pretty much every day and has averaged about 10 kilometers a day over the last 4.5 years, I still have to say that the workouts in the high mileage plan really are no joke. A big lesson here is that just because you can work your way up to 120 kilometers a week during marathon training, it does not necessarily mean that you can get up to anywhere near that distance during 5K or 10K training. Shorter distance runners tend to run lower mileage for a reason, and you and I should temper our expectations accordingly. Let's look at how the training plan is actually structured. The whole training plan covers 24 weeks in 4 6-week phases, with each phase being further split into 2 3-week cycles. Each phase has a specific training focus, which we'll go into in a second. But first, I want to address the fact that 24 weeks seems like a long time for a 5 or 10K training block. If you search about online, you'll find a lot of similar training plans tend to cover a period of about 10 or 12 weeks. So when you look at it, this one seems exceptionally long. But when you break it down, at its heart, it's only really phase 2 and 3 that comprise the core training part of this plan, with phase 1 being sort of an additional add-on if you feel like you're not at the level of fitness you want to be to start a training plan, and phase 4 kind of being a way to maintain your fitness if you've got a longer competition season or maybe multiple 5 or 10K events, all of which where you're hoping to try and run your fastest possible race. So as I just said, phase 1 is essentially a preparation phase to try and get you into the basic shape you'll need to be in to tackle the harder workouts of phase 2 and phase 3. What I did and what the book recommends is that if you're already in pretty good shape or you've been training leading into this training plan, you can just cut out phase 1 entirely and skip straight to phase 2. Phase 2 is then focused on speed work to develop power production, running efficiency, and high-end speed. There is a heavy workout focus on shorter repeats, comprising a mix of 200 meter and 400 meter speed reps. These usually come in the form of 200 meters fast at around about 3K pace or possibly faster, followed by 200 meters of slow jog recovery, and then just repeated until you finished the designated number of reps. Similarly, there's workouts with 400 meters fast and 400 meters jog recovery, and also mixed workouts where it's 200 on, 200 off, 200 on, 200 off, 400 on, 400 off, and then sets of those, which I'd say were probably my favorite workouts from this phase. I should also say that phase 2 adds in a little bit of threshold work, though not what I would usually consider a significant amount. Some of the speed workouts have threshold reps thrown in, and there is the occasional threshold focused workout with a few speed reps at the beginning or end. Then, after 6 weeks of focusing on speed, you move on to phase 3, which is a VO2 max focused training phase, where the faster R or repetition workouts are replaced with slightly slower and longer I or interval workouts. In the 5 to 10K training plans in Jack Daniel's running formula book, these interval sessions mostly consist of 1200 meter repeats at somewhere between 3 and 5K pace. For me, I believe it was a lot closer to 5K pace than 3K pace. So with all of these phases, there are essentially 2 what Jack Daniel's terms quality sessions per week, which are your 2 harder training sessions and then a long run at the weekend. And in phase 2, these 2 quality sessions were both speed work focused. Although, as I said, sometimes one of them would sacrifice a bit of speed work to throw some threshold in there. With phase 3, it was 1 interval session per week and 1 threshold focused session per week. So the amount of threshold work that you're doing in phase 3 has basically been upped from phase 2, and the repeats have been replaced with longer intervals. And then I guess I should throw in at this point that the long runs are generally capped at about 2 hours or a certain percentage of your weekly mileage, and that some of them will include a certain amount at marathon tempo. Then, after 6 weeks of phase 3, you move on to phase 4, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is essentially a supplementary phase at the end. Once you finish phase 3, you can basically go out and run your target 5K or target 10K. But because Jack Daniel's running formula and these training plans are kind of, but not necessarily exclusively, targeted towards student athletes and people with a sort of competition season, phase 4 of the training plan is laid out very much as, if you've got a race this week, do these workouts. If you don't, do these workouts. Then if you've got a race next week, do these workouts. If you don't, do these workouts. And it's structured in a way to allow you to train around multiple, I guess, races or multiple time trials if you want to do that for some reason. And so for me, I mostly skip phase 4. I did a couple of weeks up until when the weather was good, and then I just went out and ran my time trial, and that was the end. In terms of how phase 4 is structured, it is basically just the same as phase 3, but with far more detailed notes on how you should move the workouts around if you happen to have a race. Because again, as I say, it's basically just a supplemental phase for maintaining your speed and fitness if the target of your training is to go through a, well, 6-week, in this case, competition season. I'm not going to go too much into how well I managed to implement the plan. I'm just going to highlight a few things that seem relevant and may well crop up later. I skipped phase 1 entirely, started in winter with phase 2 and finished right at the beginning of summer. If you do the maths on that, you'll see that I overran the plan's length by quite a bit, and there are 3 main reasons for this. First, I got a calf strain at the end of week 4, which put me out of action for a week, and then I had another week with no hard workouts after that. Second, pretty much straight after coming back from that calf strain, I ran the Damdao City Trail and then had another week off after that to recover. I say week off, sort of week off from training, mostly doing easy runs. And then third, 6 weeks after that, now in phase 3, I ran the Gukfeng Jungle Path Trail Marathon, after which I genuinely had a week off, and then a second week where I was easing back into things before starting training again. So as you can see, it's been a bit of a stop-start training block. Regardless, I completed most of the scheduled training sessions for phase 2. However, I failed to complete many or even most of the prescribed training sessions in phase 3. Finishing in summer and having to run my final 5k time trial in hot and humid conditions meant that I couldn't directly compare my pre-training 5k and my post-training 5k time trial times, and so I had to use a pace equivalency and heat equivalency calculator to adjust my results based on the heat and humidity. The same heat and humidity that meant that I crashed out at around about 4k of my final time trial and had to throw in a distance equivalency calculation to those final results as well. All of which is to say that despite all of the calculators I used saying that I had gotten faster over the course of my training, I didn't actually end up with a directly comparable 5k time trial result, and nor did I end up with a PB. Yes and no. I think I probably will follow this plan again, or at least do training that very closely follows the plan, but I doubt that I will do it exactly as scheduled. I probably wouldn't change much, or even necessarily anything, about phase 2. I quite enjoyed the speedwork sessions. I found them tough, but manageable. And they were a nice, faster shake-up from my usual marathon-focused speed sessions, which tend to be a little slower and involve longer intervals. What I would do is a bit of pre-training with some reduced volume versions of those same workouts, just to get myself used to running at those paces on a regular basis. While I can't categorically say that suddenly increasing the intensity and volume of my speedwork sessions directly led to my calf strain, it would seem to be fairly foolish to rule out that possibility. Now that pre-training could come in the form of actually doing phase 1, but I think it's more likely that I'd throw in 1 or 2 smaller speed sessions a week into my usual running for the 4 to 6 weeks before I started training. With phase 3, on the other hand, I would change a lot. I said before that I failed to finish most of the prescribed training sessions in this phase, and to clarify, I did complete training sessions on most of the days where they were scheduled. I just frequently altered them, and by quite a lot in most cases. Jack Daniels leans quite heavily into traditional longer VO2 max intervals. In this case, lots of 1200 meter intervals at somewhere between 3 and 5k pace. Now, I have always struggled with this sort of training far more than any other sort of training modality. I hate long VO2 max intervals. In fact, I wrote them out of my own marathon training plan pretty early on into my running journey. I tried them again specifically for this plan, but I found it really difficult to complete them. I have now resolved myself to never run an interval longer than 4 minutes at 10k pace or 3 minutes at 5k pace, unless there is a very good specific reason for me to do so, like say I'm trying out a new plan. The 1200 meter intervals in this plan work out as me running slightly faster than 5k pace for around about 4.5 minutes each. And personally, I just genuinely believe that it would be more beneficial to do a higher number of shorter intervals with more frequent rest. So if I do try to follow this training plan again in future, I would adapt all of the interval sessions so that I'm doing 2 or 3 minute intervals, with the total number of intervals adjusted up so that I'm doing an equivalent amount of work. Other than that, I think I'd probably keep pretty much everything else the same. I'm fairly happy to recommend this plan to others. After all, despite a few significant setbacks and interruptions along the way, all the data that I have points to me having gotten fitter and faster by the end. Again, I would like to strongly emphasize that anyone who's thinking of taking on this plan, who isn't a very serious runner, should consider tackling the lower mileage version first and seeing how they get on with that before attempting the higher mileage one. It's important to note that it's not just the total mileage in the plans that is different, but the workouts are different too. While they follow the same lines, there is a higher volume of high quality work in the workouts in the higher mileage plan, which is to say that the workouts themselves are significantly harder. For reference, I tend to run in the region of 3,500 to 4,000 plus kilometers a year. I run marathons, I'm a sub 19-minute 5K and sub 40-minute 10K runner, and I know that's miles away from the elite, but what I'm trying to say is that I'm fairly serious for an aging hobbyist. I feel like I'm pretty serious about training, and in hindsight, I regret picking the high mileage plan. Not because of the total mileage, but because of the total workout load.